Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anne Florini. I'm professor here and director of the Center on Asia and Globalization. It is a particular pleasure to introduce to you today this afternoon's speaker, who is Michael Freiherr von Ungern-Sternberg. I hope I got the pronunciation at least remotely correct.
Wonderful.
It's a particular pleasure to have this topic today, the role of the United Nations in a changing world, as it is very apropos of major research projects that we have underway here in the school that are focused on global governance and Asia's role in international institutions and in running the world. I'm not going to give you the entire bio, which is on the flyers that I think you have all seen, but just a couple of highlights. Our speaker today is currently the Director General for the United Nations in Germany and has previously served at the United Nations itself, so I think he is in a particularly interesting, the counselor at Germany's permanent mission to the European Union in Brussels, along with a number of other high-level appointments. And I think he is going to be able to give us a very interesting perspective on the United Nations and its role in the world.
Well, thank you very much. Do you want me to speak from here, or shall I stand up?
Wherever you're comfortable.
Okay. It's difficult to see everybody back there. Well, I'll do it sitting down if you don't mind. Just remove that? Yes, wonderful. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be with you. It was a great surprise to meet a very important permanent representative from New York Times, who's been back to his home country serving as foreign minister. I was in New York from 2002 to 2007, serving with the German mission at the United Nations. And it was a particularly interesting period of time because we had, to start with, 2 years of membership in the Security Council as non-permanent members, the years 2003 and 2004, which were quite significant years for the Security Council because we had the whole debate about Iraq, about the issue when was a country going to be allowed to make the use of force. And there was a deep split in the Security Council, and it demonstrated very clearly the way the Security Council functions. And to sum it up very briefly, when the P5 are split, the non-permanent members have a chance to make a political point. When the P5 are united, the non-permanent members are basically there to vote in favor of whatever the permanent members have decided. When they were split on Iraq, and we had some very impressive meetings, including meetings at the ministers' level in February and March of 2003. And we all know what then became history. There was no Security Council resolution. The US, supported by a number of countries, decided to go to war, and we had this war, and the results are well known. Half a year later, three-quarters of a year later, the second half of 2003, a resolution was being debated, not in the Security Council, but among the P5, on an issue which is concerned to all of us, the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction to non-state actors. Everybody recognized that this is a very important issue, that the debate was not within the Security Council among the 15 members. It was a debate among the P5, which took place for 3 or 4 months. Then the P5 came to the Security Council and said, here you are, this is the text, this is the resolution we'd like to adopt next week. So there was an uneasiness among the E10, the elected 10, saying, well, we should at least be able to read the text, we need some instructions, and as we have some rules in here, which would normally require an international treaty to be negotiated among all those who want to join that treaty, we should give the rest of the membership a chance to have a look at it as well and give us their points of view. This was a pretty hot debate in the Security Council, but eventually we managed to have what is called in New York speak an open debate. big number of countries took the floor, and one day later, this resolution was adopted. What does it tell us? The open debate didn't change a comma in the text. It didn't have a great effect on what was decided. What was decided were rules applying to 192 countries, virtually universal rules, how to handle imports and exports of goods that could be used as weapons of mass destruction. So these are two examples of how the Security Council can work. Security Council has been gaining in importance over time. They have influence on the whole UN system, which go far beyond the mandate of the Security Council. They are basically, the Security Council run by the P5 basically decide who is the Secretary General and have extremely strong influence on the policy of the Secretary General in all aspects, including on the staff of the Secretary General. The major jobs in the UN, the Under-Secretary jobs, he has to consult with the P5, and the P5 makes sure that certain spots, they get the jobs. The Under-Secretary for Peacekeeping is usually a Frenchman. The Under-Secretary for Political Affairs is a Brit. The Under-Secretary in Geneva is a Russian. The Under-Secretary, well, now we have an Under-Secretary for Political Affairs who's an American. The Brits got the humanitarian aid one. So this is just to demonstrate how strong the P5 influence is on the working of the UN system as a whole. At the same time, we've had a strong debate on whether the UN is as relevant as it used to be. President Bush put this question squarely on the table on several occasions when he came to the United Nations. The present American administration has changed an attitude, saying we need the UN, we need to work in partnership. So the climate of this debate has changed to the positive. Yet, and that is why we're having this debate today, there is an open question. Is the UN still as relevant as it used to be? Is it not being challenged by other fora, like the G20, the G8, the G8 plus the Outreach 5, as one called them, Brazil, South Africa, India, and others. Fora like the African Union, playing a more and more important role in Africa, like ASEAN, like the G2, America and China. There is a question, how do these forms of cooperation, multilateral cooperation, interact? Now, this is the institutional side. Let's do a step back and look at the tasks which the international community is confronted with, the challenges. I would say we have three types of challenges nowadays, global challenges. We have these hard security challenges, basically wars, failing states. Sudan is a prominent example. Somalia, a very prominent example. Having effect, not just domestic effects, but having effect on international affairs. Somalia is a very good example because we are now all grappling with piracy for the coasts of Somalia. The Middle East conflict obviously has a huge influence. The issue of weapons of mass destruction and the proliferation of these weapons, look at the example of Iran, huge threat, terrorism. These are the hardcore challenges the international community is facing. Then there is a second category, basically development, health, environmental issues, climate, pandemics, issues, once again, that no country individually can handle. And then there's a third category which the international community is dealing with, and that is the issue of basic human rights, the issue of rule of law. Kofi Annan, when he called for a summit in 2005 on reforming the UN system, analyzed these threats. And he said, and I think this is a very good way of summing up these challenges, you're not going to get any security if you don't have enough development, because in an underdeveloped country it is very difficult to establish security. If you're not going to have any development on the other side if you don't have a minimum of security. And you're not going to have either security or development if you don't have the respect of minimum standards on human rights and minimum standards of rule of law. So we have to address all these three aspects simultaneously. And when we look at the organizations and the types of cooperation that we can use to address these challenges, we will quickly find out that there is one single organization which can do all three. And that is the UN organization. UN has something for peace and security, in particular Security Council. We have organizations for development, that is World Bank in particular, UNDP and other organizations, food security, World Food Program, health issues, WHO, and a number of other organizations, trade, WTO. We have an institution which was created recently for human rights, the Human Rights Council. The only organization having mandates in all these fields, having instruments for all these fields, having financial means, and having a global membership, which is very important. This is a strength and a weakness at the same time, obviously, because negotiating issues among 192 countries is extremely difficult. So you need, beyond this 192 format, you need, and we have seen this in the climate debate, we need some other formats to help prepare things. And I think all these regional organizations that I have been speaking about, African Union, European Union, ASEAN, the G20, the G8, all of these formats are extremely important. Yet in the end of the day, they have to feed into the UN system when we are speaking about a global threat, because only in the UN system will you be able to have the participation of all those concerned. Chancellor Merkel in 2007, Germany was president of the G8. We had a very strong debate about where to deal with the climate challenge. There was an American position at the time saying, well, let's have the 20 most important emitting countries, those who are creating or responsible mainly for climate change, discuss this issue. And the German position at the time was, okay, they have to discuss this issue, but let's feed it into the UN system, because how can you discuss such an issue if you don't have countries that are most affected sitting at the table, having big stakes in this? You get islands in the Pacific who will virtually vanish, because as sea levels will rise, they will no longer exist. They will be underwater. They will be submerged. So the idea was to have a process in a smaller format, but then bring it to the bigger format. Now you will tell me that the bigger format, Copenhagen, didn't particularly well work. And of course, there's no guarantee that you will reach satisfactory solutions very quickly. But I think there is a recognition that we need the UN because of its legitimacy, because we have a clear set of rules, because it is politically accepted. Now these comparative advantages of the UN are likely to be lost if the UN is no longer seen as having political legitimacy. And there's a risk that this organization that was created over 60 years ago, and that has a structure which is older than 60 years, is no longer seen as being politically legitimate because it does not reflect geopolitical realities of today's world. And in this respect, the Security Council obviously is particularly important because, as I said, the Security Council has a role and has a influence which goes far beyond the mandate that the Charter has provided it with, namely maintenance of international peace and security. Now, the Security Council today is composed of 5 permanent, as I've said, and 10 non-permanent states. Originally, it was composed of 11 states altogether, 5 permanent and 6 non-permanent. That was reformed in the mid-60s. 1963, discussions started, and 1965, the reform came into effect. Now, when this reform took place, the non-permanent was saying, well, we've grown in size, there are more members now, that should be reflected in the Security Council. P5 didn't particularly like this. What happened was you need a two-thirds majority. You need a two-thirds majority in the General Assembly to reform, and then you need this reform to be ratified by two-thirds of the membership, including the P5. So if they don't ratify, one of them doesn't ratify, it doesn't enter into force. So in 1963, there were 2 countries of the P5 who didn't like it, said no. It was France and the Soviet Union. They opposed this reform. There were 2 countries of the P5 who abstained, which is more or less a polite way of saying no. It was the UK and United States. And there was 1 country in favor, which was China, and China at the time was represented by Taiwan in the Security Council. In the United Nations. Now, you could have assumed that with such a big opposition of the P5, this reform would never enter force. Yet what happened is 2 years later, they had all ratified it, because it takes a lot of political guts to not ratify something which 100 countries or so have ratified. Very difficult to explain to these countries. So there's one lesson. You don't have a veto in the General Assembly, and the permanent members will not veto a reform if it is not directed very squarely against their interest. The assumption is if you would take away the right of veto, which many countries in the General Assembly consider to be outdated, if you would try to take that away from them, they would veto it. If you would try to take away from them the status of permanency, they would veto it, it's clear. But all the rest, if it's not totally fantasy, it's not totally crazy, they would probably go along with. There has been a strong discussion on how to reform the Security Council among the non-permanent members, so the 180-odd countries who are not permanent members of the Security Council. There are different groups there. There's the so-called G4, that's a group composed of Germany, Brazil, India, and Japan, saying if we want to really change the Security Council, we need to get in countries that the P5 will respect, will not regard as mere tourists. Because the attitude today, and I was trying to show you that to you, is the P5 have a common position. They really expect the non-permanent members to run along, and they regard them basically as nice partners who are there for 2 years as guests who are going to leave. If you put in their countries who have political weight and who are there also permanent, maybe not having the right of veto, then they will have to respect these countries and ask for their opinions, because they will have to deal with these countries on a permanent basis. And that's why the G4 model, as it was called, said let's add 6 new permanent members. They shouldn't have the right of veto, at least not in the beginning, and add another few non-permanent members as well, bringing up the size of the Security Council to 25. Now, there was a group of countries, and this debate has been going on for many, many years, over 15 years. There was a group of countries, it was called the Coffee Club. Coffee Club because they met having a coffee in the UN, so it was called the Coffee Club. And the Coffee Club said, we are not true believers in creating new permanent seats, because permanent seats, they tend to look at their attitudes in a national way and not necessarily reflecting the interests of the larger membership. It would be much more democratic if they would have to go to be elected quite regularly. So they were opposed against this idea of permanency. Since then, big battles have been fought. You, Ambassador, have witnessed that. We have never gone for a vote, at least not on the substance, on procedural aspects, yes. And in a way, we are stuck a little bit. Now, a new proposal has emerged saying, well, let's try, we can't resolve this issue of permanency, so let's try and do something for an interim period. Let's try and do something for 15, 20, 25 years. And during that time, we'll put in there a couple of countries for long periods. But after a long period, they have to go for re-election if they want to stay in, or somebody else moves in. And after a test period of 10, 20, 25 years, we will review this process, and we'll see how well they have done, and if we want to continue in the same way, or if you want to create a new set of permanent members. Well, it sounds very sensible. To me, it sounds very sensible. And the German position has indeed been, well, let's have a look at it. We've actually said, well, if they'd stay in there for 12 years or 15 years, indeed, they would have, potentially could have strong influence on what's happening. Because 12 years is 3 terms of an American president. Imagine India being in the Security Council for 12 years. I don't think the American president would say, well, who are the Indians? They'd really look at what's their position and try to convince them, and there would be arguments, and I think the whole functioning of the Security Council would look very different from what it is today. Now you can imagine on the other side, Coffee Club, Pakistan, and Italy, Mexico, Argentina, other countries, Egypt, Algeria, supporting them. They'd say, well, 15 years, 12 years, very long time. Once they're in that long, they'll never move out again. We don't like that. 5 years, that could be an idea, but not 10 years. After 5 years, they should move out. So there is an aspect of regional rivalry that is important here. They're not looking at it from the angle of the UN. They're basically looking at it from a regional angle. This is my personal view. Italy, who we get along with tremendously, it's a very good partnership in the European Union. They're a founding member of the European Union. We have a lot of common interests. I understand you're Italian representative. I'm very open, and these are personal remarks. Don't get it wrong. But there is the argument that, once the Germans are going to be in there that long, we are going to weaken the European quality of our foreign policy. And we should more stress having a European approach to foreign policy aspects, important foreign policy issues, rather than strengthening individual member states. In Europe, we obviously have the special situation that we already have 2 European Union members being permanent members in the Security Council, France and UK. Pakistan and India, in a way, are similar. Not the same kind of situation, but I think Pakistanis are very strongly living under the impression once India moves in there. Now, I don't think the bilateral relations are nearly as good as the one between Italy and Germany. Once they move in there, they will use this privileged situation. And Ambassador, you may judge this much better, and I would be very interested to hear your personal, stressing personal view on this. They are worried that once they have this position, the Indians would have this position of strength in the Security Council, they would use this against Pakistani interests. In Latin America, something very similar. Mexico, I think biggest economy of Latin America, doesn't quite follow the argument that Brazil should, being the biggest country, should move in there as a permanent. So there is this element of status, of regional rivalry. That is where we stand. The P5, needless to say, are probably, as a whole, pretty happy the way things are today. They think it would complicate things to bring in all these others. I think the French and the Brits have probably understood that in the long run, it doesn't look too good being a permanent member, telling bigger countries, emerging powers, younger, more dynamic countries, greater growth rates, telling them what to do in terms of peace and security. So in particular, the French have adopted a position, and President Sarkozy has been very clear. He's saying, we need to reform the Security Council. Bring in these players. This is not just because he has a larger view of global issues. It is also because he has a French interest in this, a national French interest, because it would we have a reform today, it would stabilize the French position in the Security Council. If we're not going to have a reform in 20 or 30 years, his analysis is, I would assume, that the credibility of France as a permanent member would diminish. So there are varying degrees of within the P5 group, but as a whole, I would say the P5 are not totally unhappy the ways are today, because, of course, it is quite convenient to have such an influence, and to adapt to new circumstances can be quite difficult. Now, I think there is a strong belief within the UN that the UN, among the membership, is a very useful organization. Yet, if we don't reform the UN, I think the influence on world affairs will shift. The UN will not be abolished, but it will shift from the UN to other formats. G20 is just one of them. I think, by the way, that the initiative that Singapore has taken in the UN, this so-called 3G process, is a very intelligent one. The 3G process is basically the idea, how do you link up the rest of the UN membership with the G20? It is recognized that we need the G20. Singapore says yes, and the other countries participating in this process say yes, the G20, we are not opposing the G20, we need the G20. If they do their job properly, they can make a huge contribution to global issues, solving global issues. But we need a link. We don't have that link, there's a risk that they will take decisions without having heard major stakeholders, which, depending on the issue, may vary. We're speaking about piracy off the coast of Somalia. You have stakeholders, basically those who have trade going that way. If you're speaking about terrorism, my guess is that many countries, smaller countries in Africa, or WMD, they don't really worry about that. For them, food, health, poverty, those are the big ones. So, to varying degrees, we need to link up the G20 with the rest of the membership. But I maintain what I was saying. The UN cannot be replaced by a G20, even if the G20 is complemented by this 3G process, because they don't have a charter. They don't have the means. The UN has financial means, has political means, has know-how. Who is able to perform peacekeeping in Africa? Perform peacekeeping in other parts of the world? Well, the UN is uniquely positioned to do this. So, to sum up, we believe that we should approach reform. It's not just about Security Council. We're speaking about human rights, the review of the Human Rights Council. We're speaking about many other areas. But disarmament, very important issue, also needing the UN to deal with it. We need to modernize the United Nations. It does not make any sense in a world that is ever more interconnected to get rid of the most sophisticated and most comprehensive and most legitimate organization that we have. The risk we are running today is that we are going to see, and I think there is a big probability that's going to happen, different multilateral fora being used quite discretionary. Sometimes people will go to the G20, other times they will go to the G8, third occasions, the G2 might get together. It is something that I would call messy multilateralism. You don't have any more rules. And it can work from time to time. But in the end of the day, it doesn't give you a framework which guarantees you the participation of all stakeholders. And political processes normally only work if you have the stakeholders who are at the table. Only then will they be willing to participate, to contribute. And that is why I think we need to push forward for Security Council reform, after which I think the rest of reforms within the UN system will fall in place. I think that's as much as I wanted to say in the way of an introduction.
Thank you very much for an extraordinarily articulate summary of a very wide range of important issues. I have two questions that I am extremely eager to ask myself, but in view of this illustrious audience, let me first turn to the audience and ask for questions and comments. And could I ask you to very briefly introduce yourselves and to use the mic because this is being recorded?
Thank you very much. I am Nino Felicani, Ambassador of Italy. First of all, I would like to thank very much Ambassador von Ungern. He was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bonn with Klaus Kleiber, I think, when I was working at the Genscher-Colombo Act. It was in 1993, 1995. And at that time, together with Germany, at that time it was the Federal Republic of Germany, not yet unified. We had a vision of building a unified Europe. If you look in the paper here of his biography, you will see that at this time, Ambassador was for the European Community, and then it became the European Union. We have been doing a lot of path together, and certainly I will not contradict him in saying that Italy and Germany are really good friends in a series of areas in the world, whether they might be political, economical, peacekeepings in Afghanistan, and so on. We have been working very much, and if we had the European Union now, it's because these kind of seeds were planted at that time by our two countries. Let's not forget that. Coming to United Nations affairs, I would like, of course, not to take too much of your time, but I also can assure we've been working on that very at length. And there are two aspects which strike me. And one of them, first of all, I can fully agree with what Ambassador von Ungern has said. That is to say, the P5s dictate the rules so far. That is the first point of his speech tonight. Then we must ask ourselves why. For a very simple reason. Because they are not accountable. Nobody will ever take them out of their seats. In the new proposals which is on the table now, the idea of creating new permanent seats simply takes away the concept of accountability for other countries, which are those which, if this happened, would be sitting there, whether they have the veto or not. They would never be accountable anymore. First point. Second point, the coffee club was not, it still is. We are still meeting, we are still working, and even from some of our countries are like Algeria, as the ambassador said, very good. Why not Algeria? In our vision, every country in the United Nations has a single vote. Every country is as important as any other. This is our position. And for what concerns the ideas that we oppose new permanent members, It is not because it's linked to regional rivalries, but simply because it's linked to a logical and juridical aspect, which is the aspect I was saying, that in the idea of having new permanent members, the accountability will disappear. You give a blank check. Now, this idea of interims is, of course, tentative to be, let's get on board, let's stay there, and then we'll see what happens in 15 years. Certainly this is, of course, an hypothesis which is very difficult to be accepted without having, any other sort of counterbalancing measures. Certainly on the other hand, we are favorable to any possible solutions which could encompass the maximum widespread audience. The ideas that Italy and other countries are pursuing perfectly coincides with Germany. That is, we want to have a new, more efficient, more updated United Nations. The global challenges, the three categories that Ambassador von Ungern has been saying, fine, we have to face that. This is the true world. We have said that also during the presidency of the G8 of Italy, which has been following the German one. No question about that. The approach of the United Nations reform, from our point of view, and especially the Security Council, cannot foresee the aspect of accountability. So we foresee the augmentation, better working methods, new non-permanent members, okay, for any regional organization, but no new permanent members, because the permanent members would go back with the same attitude as the P5s. Now, this is something which, in any event, no juridical aspect would ask them to be accountable once they are sitting there. As far as, I would simply say, sorry to take too much of your time, all the other aspects, that is to say, improving the relations with the General Assembly, better tackling, better interaction, better transparency, better working methods, which is also, I think, one of the proposals of Singapore and other countries like Singapore. We can very well go along. So the idea is that we have to work again, and nothing has been said, nothing has been decided. All the efforts we have been doing in 15 years, we hope, will not be in vain. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. First of all, I should like to congratulate Ambassador von Ungern-Sternberg for an extremely interesting expose. I'm from Bangladesh, and my name is Iftikhar Chaudhry. I'm a fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies. But in my previous avatar, I used to be, for a while, the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh, and I was a long-term permanent representative to the United Nations, both in New York and Geneva. And the period that Ambassador von Ungern-Sternberg was there overlapped with mine, and I was particularly involved with the Secretary General's reforms of 2005. I was a facilitator, drafting the reform document, and my own contribution was in the area of R2P, which is called the responsibility to protect. Now, on the Security Council reforms, and this is the key position, there was a general sentiment, and I appreciate everything what the ambassador of Italy has said, and Italy has had and still has an extremely important role in this debate, as does Pakistan, and the ambassador of Pakistan is sitting to my right. We are somewhere in between, as you can imagine, but we like to stabilize things in the United Nations, because the United Nations is extremely important for countries like us. Ambassador has described the 3G, it's called the Good Governance Group that Singapore leads, and the least developed countries that we lead. And for other countries, United Nations gives us legitimacy, United Nations gives us intellectual support, material support, etc., and it's very important. Now, the structural reforms, we believe that, of course, given Germany's contribution, given Japan's contribution, there is absolutely no reason why we'll not forever be electing Germany, Japan, to the Security Council at every election. Germany sits today, as does India, I think, among the G4 in this council right now. The only problem is when countries see themselves as representing the region. As you can imagine now, in the coffee club, the membership of the coffee club comprise the neighbors of these aspirants to the permanent membership of the Security Council. And that is not merely a coincidence. The countries that we've named, Italy vis-a-vis Germany, Japan, China vis-a-vis Japan, Pakistan vis-a-vis India, Mexico vis-a-vis Brazil. So you see, I mean, the membership of the coffee club is coterminous with the countries that border the permanent members. But there will have to be an answer, and we are all persuaded that there will have to be structural reforms, systemic reforms of the United Nations. How best to do it is, it is a major decision which will need somewhat of a consensual approach. In other words, a vast preponderant majority of the membership must unite behind what the decisions taken. If the Americans have a saying that if it ain't broke, don't mend it, that kind of thing, and they fall behind that even at this point in time. And right now, with the emphasis given by the Obama administration on, we are seeing a completely new situation. A reform that would be acceptable to all is to have the aspirants go to the international community every 2 years and say that, well, how have we performed the last 2 years? Have we been representative of the ethos, the values that we are meant to represent? And will you elect us again? We can change the rules to alter the possibility of re-elections to the Security Council. At this point in time, my sense is, I'm speaking purely in a private capacity, and I have been involved with the United Nations for decades, a purely private capacity. My sense is that the House will take that, will accept that. More than that, at this point, could be difficult. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. The first point I'd like to make, it's not about Germany. This has nothing to do with Germany. It has nothing to do with Italy. The main purpose of this reform is to better reflect today's world. And the main purpose of this reform, in the end of the day, is, as the membership, big majority of the membership sees it, to have a better representation by the global south, by the southern hemisphere, because they feel underrepresented in there. We have 3 African members all the time, yet Africa says we are totally underrepresented. We don't have a single permanent member in here. And this is the African position. We are the only continent without the right of veto. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding in this sentence, as I feel it. But this is their position. The misunderstanding being there are no continental vetoes. The French nor the Brits have ever asked us whether they should make use of their right of veto. They never do it because it's in the European interest. They do it because it's their national interest. And I think the same applies to the United States. Besides, when the Africans say this, the Latin Americans really get angry because they say, do you believe that the US veto is an American veto, covering the whole of the American North and South continent? So they feel more or less in the same situation. Our departing point when enlarging the Security Council is that we say there are 2 criteria. And these criteria are actually in the Charter, and they make political sense. The criteria are to be permanent member or to be a long-term member. We should look at, do these countries contribute to the objectives of the United Nations? And that you can contribute in very different ways. You can contribute financial ways, obviously, but also in terms of peacekeeping, in terms of promoting development, promoting disarmament, promoting climate change policies, promoting juridical aspects. So there are many ways. It's not just a question of how much money a certain country is paying into the budget. This is the one category, or this is the one aspect one should look at. The other one is a regional balance. You need the Security Council to have a minimum of regional balance, otherwise whole regions will feel that they're left out. Now, the whole reform is not taking place because of Germany. The whole reform is basically taking place because the Global South needs to be better represented in the Security Council. If you're going to tell the Global South you're getting a couple of extra 2-year seats, Mr. Foreign Minister, we will very quickly be confronted with the argument, there we go, another proof of discrimination. They want to have... Africa says that very clearly. You have 53 countries who are saying, not only we want permanent seats, we want a veto. And if we don't get that, we're not going to a vote. The Africans have put forward a draft resolution. They put it in blue, and we told them, okay. The G4 said, we're pretty close to that. No? We're not that far apart. We don't like the idea about the veto in there, because they say the new permanent members should have a veto. But we said, okay, let's go for a vote. Well, the reaction of the Africans was, no, we don't want to go for a vote. We don't want to vote on our own resolution because we have a feeling it's going to fail. And the second reason being because, same as in every other continent, they can't make up their minds who their permanent members should be. Well, the classical way of resolving these issues is to go for a vote and find out who gets the most votes. Now, people have been saying, this was one of the arguments the Coffee Club was using. Let's not rush these issues and let's find consensus. This is so important, we need to find consensus. Well, we haven't rushed it. This item has been on the agenda of the General Assembly since 1979. That's 30 years ago. And there has been a special group, the so-called open-ended working group, which people tend to call the never-ending working group, not having produced any results, not any results, because there was the rule of consensus applied to this working group. It is an invitation for those who are not getting 100% of what they want to say no, and then nothing happens. We need to think about, can we live with something less than 100%? And this question goes to the G4, goes to the Coffee Club, goes to the P5. Once again, I don't think that P5 in the end of the day will be able, for political reasons, to block things unless we're really kicking hard at something they consider as their property. We need to think about, can we live with 90% or 80%? You know, we have been reflecting a long time about this, and one can come to the conclusion that on the extremes, there are countries who don't want reform unless they get 100%. What is the answer to this? We don't reform? We don't reform, the UN will go down. And that is bad for all of us. We should reform, even if these extremes say we're not happy and we might vote against. So what? If you have 192 countries and you get support of 150, it's great. In every country, all over the world, if you have a majority of 150 out of 192, well, it's ideal. Anything that goes beyond that, by the way, only worked in dictatorial regimes. There you got 95% approval. But except that, very difficult. Very difficult. At least in the international scene. In the European Union, we have convergences of interest, but we have divergences of interest, very tough ones. We have areas where we work well, and that is where we apply qualified majority voting. Germany has been of the opinion we should have a lot more qualified majority voting in the area of foreign policy. It was never accepted. That's why in the area of foreign policy we haven't made huge progress in the European Union, unfortunately. We are hoping that it will improve, but it will be a very slow process. Even having a foreign minister, which we are not allowed to call foreign minister. So I think, you know, reflecting in greater detail about the possibilities that an interim model offers is worthwhile. I don't think the 2-year method works, because what you will find as a result is that after 2 years, one country, another country will come. Let's pretend India was in there for 2 years. They go for re-election. Well, you will find other countries saying it's our turn. Why India the whole time? there is going to be an automatic rotation, and the result of that is that you are not changing anything about the structure of the Security Council. And I think the position of my country would be, instead of having a window dressing reform, which doesn't change anything in the structures, let's not reform at all. Let's not pretend we have a reform which is not really a reform. The pretense of a reform would be worse. You would increase the numbers in the Security Council. The work would, I think the P5, it would be an invitation to the P5 to work even more in separation of the rest. So I really think we need to consider what is permanency, what is the meaning of permanency. Meaning of permanency, on the one hand, can mean forever, the next 2,000 years. Sounds rather peculiar, huh? 2,000 years, political concept. We don't have many precedents. Permanency can also mean, well, there's somebody there who you really have to count with, because he's going to be there for a long time. So if somebody were to ask me, is 50 years, is that permanency? My answer would be, yeah, that's pretty much permanent, you know, a lifetime. What, I mean, 50 years' time, some of us will not be there. some of us will, but some of us won't be there anymore. So 50 years one can live with. At least for 100 years is like having the property. Is 20 years permanency? Yeah. Not, you know, there's something. Is 5 years permanency? No, definitely not. 5 years not. 2 years not. 10 years probably not. So somewhere between 20 and 10, or there is a change from a quantity into a new quality. And this is the balancing point we have to look for. And when we have found this balancing point, we should try it out. And I guarantee you that you don't get unanimous support for that. You don't get consensus for that. You have to go to a vote. If it is left unresolved, once again, we are weakening the United Nations, and that should be our overriding interest in the whole process. But I accept your point, Ambassador, on accountability. That is an important aspect. And we have introduced, even in the G4 proposal, which you don't like, we have introduced many elements of accountability. We have, not just because you like it, because we believe in it. Because we believe in it. So we shouldn't sort of define this whole process as being Italy versus Germany. We tend to have good football matches. Most of the time the Italians win, but we don't mind. This is much bigger. This is really, and the reason for the reform not having taken place is not because developed countries versus the developing world. It's not that. The most difficult problem is within the developing world. It's within the global south. My assumption is as soon as we get Africans, 2/3 of the Africans around, we will have a reform. You know, we have 53 countries who have up to now said we're not willing to vote. That's more than a quarter of the membership in the UN. It's impossible. So they have a big responsibility. And we have a responsibility to develop something. And Germany, I'm happy to say, has been trying to create so-called overarching groups. Probably we didn't come up with the right answers in these overarching groups. But we had a variety of countries, including Italy, including smaller countries, including developing countries, who have been working at this. But we should get away from the ideology that is in there, a north-south ideology. We need the countries who are providing resources. We need the stakeholders. We need a regional balance. That is the answer. So we haven't given up hope. I think the debate that has taken place was quite useful, actually. But a political process which goes on and on and on loses momentum. And at a certain point in time, people don't want it anymore. Last year, I was, having left New York for 2 years already, I was back in New York, and there was a debate. And there's an Afghan ambassador, Ambassador Tanin, who's chairing these debates. And he was very nice because there was a new colleague, the new Dutch ambassador was there. He said, well, I welcome the new Dutch ambassador. I believe it's the first time he's going to speak in the General Assembly. I would particularly want to invite him here, welcome him here, and I give him the floor. The Dutch ambassador said, yes, welcome. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Indeed, I have just arrived, but I have to tell you something. I was here 10 years ago as DPR, as Deputy Permanent Representative. And I can tell you, I haven't heard a single word that was new to me today. So after 10 years being away, nothing had changed. And there's a risk in there. And, political leaders, and that includes the German government, say, well, you better produce some results, because the foreign minister, he's there for 4 years, he's there for 8 years. Well, maybe we've had 1 or 2 that have been there a little longer than 8 years, but they want to see a result at a certain stage. Otherwise, they lose faith in the whole process and they turn to some other fora. Germany is in plenty of other fora. That's not the problem. They will attract the political interest. There's a lady. Sorry for having speaking so long.
Hi there. My name is Paula Murphy-Ives, and I spent 10 years working in Geneva in the lower depths of the UN. And I really, when I hear all of you speak about these efforts to reform, I can't tell you how that touches me personally, because spending 10 years in there really trying to push things forward and knowing that the machine itself has some kind of fundamental flaws it's frustrating, but I think having this hope to reform it is so important. But when you started your talk talking about Iraq, that was just one of the things that reminds us that there are big problems with the decision making in the UN. And secondly, when you look at the issues that the UN has to deal with, the R2P, trying to regulate energy, looking at the internet and content and the financial situation, financial security, looking at the drugs trade, weapons trade. It seems like there are so many issues facing us that the question we're talking about today about the stakeholders, there's this whole other area of stakeholders, the drugs traders, the arms dealers, the private sector, the environmental activists, all these people. So when you look at Iraq, when you look at the issues, and you look at the stakeholders, for me those three things lead us to question overall, does the UN have the same fate as the League of Nations? Or do we have to wait to something like World War II? There's some major calamity, so we realize that maybe the UN has failed. And we should start over again. That reforming something like this is, I don't know. I don't know what to say, because I agree that each little reform does do something. But I feel that the issues that are confronting us and the complexity of the problems demand a creativity and a new kind of energy. So my question is, I'd be interested to hear about the debate in 2005, because I didn't follow the reform so closely. Did that question actually come up? Should we just start from zero and do something completely different? And the second question would be, you mentioned that the Obama administration you're picking up that there's a real sense of leadership there. Do you think they would have the leadership to be able to do something like that, to say global governance is so important to us that we need to just overhaul? That's my question. Thanks.
A nice narrow question. There are several several other hands popping up, but I'd actually like to follow up on that question myself a bit. With the emphasis on things like Security Council reform, one of the concerns that often comes up is that this is the wrong debate to be having. That these fundamental questions that you went into it at some length about how difficult it is to find consensus around some set of principles that indicate what is legitimacy for a decision-making body that is less than a committee of the whole it's fundamentally unachievable, and that what it really tends to degenerate into is a competition for prestige rather than for improving the efficacy of the organization. That's more of a comment. The question is specifically on the Security Council reform. Are there any decisions that the Security Council has made over the past 15 or 20 years that you think would have turned out differently with a different body of representation? If you had representation along the lines of the principles that Germany or others are putting forward, what difference would it actually make in terms of the efficacy of the body? Not the legitimacy of the decisions and therefore the willingness of the rest of the world community to go along with them. I completely take your point on that. But would it actually change the nature of the decisions? The second question builds on the comment that was just made is is the United Nations trying to do more than is achievable for any one organization? Does it make sense to have an organization that is attempting to be the world body dealing with the world's problems? Perhaps what the United Nations should concentrate on is the set of issues that it was founded primarily to address, which is peace and security, which are inherently intergovernmental questions, and that it is simply not the right set of actors to be addressing questions of development and environment and all of the rest of kinds of issues which require a different set of decision makers and a different set of skills.
That's a lot of questions. Can we take yours later on?
It kind of follows on with that.
Well, I'll try to answer these, and if I miss something that you are asking, follow up, okay? Create something new. In Europe, we are confronted with that all the time. We have reinvented the EU many, many times. We have not reinvented, but tried to refine it, to develop it. And every time people ask the question, well, is this not outdated? Are we not spending too much on agriculture? And some quite fundamental questions. The political reality is you don't reinvent these things. Maybe if you have a World War II, we could start reinventing things. But I would rather advise not to have a war just because of that. So I think that is, if we wouldn't have the UN today, I think we'd stand a chance actually of creating this organization, because everybody would understand a global challenge needs a global response, and a global response can only work if you have a global membership in a global organization. But as we have the UN, and they're not that bad, Kofi Annan never, your question was that considered to create something from scratch? Well, that was never considered. The clear answer, it was never considered by Kofi Annan or any other person seriously dealing with the reform of the United Nations. Your second question was Obama. Is he the person to introduce such a deep and important reform? I actually hope when Obama came to power, because he had made clear he would have a very different attitude to the UN than previous administration, that the UN would take a proactive stance in this. And I think there were debates in Washington on this issue. But I think the moment has been missed. We've had 1 year of US administration. This present administration has so many balls in the air now, domestic and international ones. They're not going to add another one if the risk is that this other one will fall down, I don't know. A government can only handle so many important issues at a time. And I think the impression was this is going to be a controversial debate, and do we really want to run this risk to make friends with some but make enemies with others? I think they avoided the tough decision-making. I think the American prestige, well, that's from the point of view of the G4, could have increased immensely. They had come up, said, listen, we have invented the United Nations immediately after the war in San Francisco. It was American leadership, and we are going to reinvent this organization now. And they could have put something on the table. It would have changed the whole atmosphere, and I think we would probably be discussing about going to vote or agreeing on some kind of solution. Not necessarily the G4 proposal, although the Americans have always made clear they're in favor of new permanent members. But maybe they would have said, okay, we have to sort of balance this. We have other forces. We have Mexico as an immediate neighbor. We don't want to make them totally unhappy. They might have come up with something else. But I think they could have changed the whole rule and the whole dynamism and the whole momentum of this reform. But it didn't happen, and I don't think it will happen in the near future. Legitimacy was your question. Or is it just prestige wanting to be in there? Now, there is a misconception about the Security Council. The Security Council was never meant to be a democratic body. Never. I mean, the proof of this is that you have the right of veto. The right of veto is so undemocratic. There's nothing more undemocratic than the veto, because you have one country that can prevent a decision taken by all the rest. And it happens. You have the situations where you have one veto and all the rest are either in favor or abstain. So the idea behind the Security Council is really you need to bring in powerful countries if important questions are at stake, peace, international peace and security, and they carry the main responsibility of the maintenance of this international peace. What we are saying is today these countries aren't the countries they used to be. They don't represent the world as they did represent the world, as they were the most powerful countries after 1945. Today the world has changed. And those countries who after the Second World War were not very significant on the international stage, countries who were colonized, countries who were weak, economically weak, politically weak, after 60 years of time, they have developed themselves into becoming major actors in the world in many issues. Military, speak about climate change. You can't have a debate on climate change while excluding Brazil or India. It's ridiculous. They are so important actors in these areas. So that is the reasoning. It's not about prestige. Certainly in terms of political debate, if you ask a politician, there's always this element of prestige in there. But I think if you're coming from the UN as an organization, you need to include these players. Otherwise, you will not have a strong Security Council. Your second question was, would we have had different results in the past if we had changed the composition of the Security Council? I think that's only part of the question. Maybe many of these issues the results would have been the same, but they would have been carried by a group of countries which would make these decisions sound much more plausible, and which in the implementation of these decisions, you would have much more success, because you would have many more countries who effectively contribute to implementing these decisions, who have been part of the decision-making process. If you include a stakeholder, he's likely to be more forthcoming in implementing decisions. But beyond that, I do believe that certain decisions would probably have looked different. The last part of your question was, should we have the UN only deal with issues of peace and security, not with development? If you look at the Charter, peace and security is one major aspect, but it's not the only one. Development, social issues, human rights are very much included, disarmament very much included among the objectives of the United Nations. So we are not acting outside of the mandate of the United Nations. Indeed, I believe it would be wrong to restrict UN to issues of international peace and security, because I think there are so many links, as I said, between peace, security, development, and human rights. You need the three to be able to move forward. But I'm not saying they're the only body that should deal with these issues. What I'm saying is we need regional organizations, we need the G8, we need the G20. All of these are very important. But at a certain stage, they have to feed into a UN system.
I'm afraid we have pretty much run out of time. There was this one person we promised the opportunity to ask a supplementary question, if there was something that was missed.
No.
Okay. All right. Of course.
Well, Ambassador, this is the High Commissioner of Pakistan. I'm privileged to be here today to listen to your very persuasive arguments. But I think the very arguments that you've made throughout your address and in response to various questions can be turned around by the other aspirants who also feel they should be part of that system. Now, larger countries which feel now the G4 that feels that they should be included in the UN Security Council system, they are more or less, and we cannot deny the fact are driven by prestige. They may have more influence, they may have gained more influence in the last 15, 20 years, but we cannot ignore the fact that a couple of those countries do carry the regional baggage with them. Secondly, if we feel that any reforms need to be done, then reforms should be such that are acceptable to the majority of the membership of the United Nations. Cannot be a sort of, let's say, two polar G4 and UFC positions going on and on and on. And in my opinion, if one studies the UFC position, that includes a lot of compromises, which will take along a much more majority of UN membership countries when there is more rotational non-permanent members with the UN Security Council. So I feel that this debate becomes prolonged. I mean, over the years, we both the, let's say, positions have to begin to start compromising for any reforms to start. And I think, personally, having studied the G4 position, they are very rigid about it. There should be more and more compromise forthcoming from the G4 side. And I'm sure then we'll have more flexibility from the African group. And perhaps the meeting ground could be the UFC proposals. Thank you.
I'll give a very brief answer. Number one, if there was a clear majority of the position for the position of the coffee club, you should go for a vote. Simple. We've always said that. Let's go for a vote. We like voting. We've always said let's go for. Actually, among the G4, Germany always said let's go for a vote in 2005. You never have the guarantee that you get the required 128 votes. But even if we had only had 110 votes, you know, you could have said, well, you didn't make it because you need 120.
Preponderant majority, that's what you meant.
Sorry?
Preponderant.
Yes, but 128 is pretty much. It's a two-thirds majority. So we like voting, and I really invite everybody who thinks they're going to achieve a good result, let's go for a vote. It's the most democratic way. It's the rule of the Charter, by the way. We shouldn't wait for 180 countries. It's not going to happen. The risk you're running, if you wait for that, it is never going to happen. And the risk of that is that you are really destroying this organization. I do agree with you, however, when you're saying, let's find something, you know, we have proven over many years now that we're not going to get, probably not going to get either 100% G4 or 100% coffee club. Let's try and sense if there's a compromise out there, possibilities of compromise. The only thing I'm saying is we should not make false compromise. If the thing ends up by saying let's have another set of countries, another 10 countries going for 2-year seats, which might be re-electable, it's not going to change, that's our conviction, the workings of the Security Council. It will make it bigger but not better, because it will maintain the stronghold of the P5. And if that happens, I think we have a false reform. What the world is looking for is that the Security Council should better represent today's geopolitical realities. And the geopolitical reality is that the P5 are no longer where they were in 1945. I think that is uncontested.
But the veto power, they still have that.
You know, of course. I wouldn't mind the veto power being abolished. But the political reality is that it's not going to happen. And that is the common understanding in New York. So once again, I don't believe that anybody... Germany has been quite vocal about this. We have said so very openly in New York. Let's think about some kind of an interim thing, but don't speak about 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, because it will not change the structure of the Security Council. and we will see. But the momentum will not be there forever. And at a certain stage, member states will give up and say, well, let's wait for something major to happen, and then we will see. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.